right, so right now I'm talking to my microphone, so it might sound a little bit weirder than normal, but this is a shorter video that I normally put out to address a specific question that was asked in my YouTube side chat, which is how do I, as an atheist, define God? God is whatever the monkey you were talking to says. Yeah. Does it come to God can be anything? Okay, so yeah, it is a convoluted argument that I'm making, and I see how people get lost there. So the intent, it you got to think about it from like different perspectives and try to kind of hold them all together. So their intent to describe God is that it's referencing a thing, an actual thing, and that actual thing should be able to be observed, right, by them because they're making a claim about it. And if it's observable by them, then it should be observable by me, assuming that I have the same observations. So this is like their starting intent is to describe a thing that exists external to their mind. But from my perspective, right, I take like an overview effect here. I kind of try to mentally zoom out. And when I mentally zoom out, I'm aware of a multitude of gods, a multitude of different conversations I've had from people who have said this, that, and the other thing is God. Zooming in, I know not to do that because I'm only talking to this one person and they've only told me one concept of God. The only way that I know that there's other definitions is when I zoom out and I have that overview effect and I remember all the prior conversations that I have. And I think a lot of atheists and theists have a difficult time frame shifting like that, going in and out of whether you're referring to you're talking to the person about what they're attempting to describe based on perception, right? Based on some observed perceivable trait or characteristic of this extant, this thing they're talking about. Now I'm scoping the whole conversation in like that, where it's just like you could see that I'm tainting it heavily with empiricism. Like I'm putting that on my interlocutor, and I am putting it on my interlocutor because it's the nature of the question that I'm asking. I'm asking people to prove the existence of. I'm not saying prove God's fat to me. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying prove God's round, prove God's tall. I'm not asking people to provide those kinds of descriptions. I'm asking them to provide the ontology so that I can differentiate between, gaslighting, honesty and mistake, honesty and accuracy. I need to be able to differentiate my interlocutor's claims about God. So when I'm asked, what do I mean by God? I give them the overview effect definition from my most accurate representation of what I'm observing down on Earth, right? I take, so I'm not saying, hey, over here it's a sun, over here it's a Jesus, over here it's a whatever. I'm saying in here in my mind, as I look down on Earth and try to understand the best context, the best usage that all of the monkeys, I've realized that the only way that I can provide an accurate definition of that is to shift the topic. Instead of talking about the ontology, giving you a definition of God, I give you the one thing I can appeal to ontology about, and that's the behavior of humans. There are humans down there on that planet, and they are acting and they are behaving and they are believing. And atheism saying that on the topic of God, they're not languaging properly. They're violating their own rules, our own rules, right? Overview effect, I'm an alien. Down on Earth, I'm a human, right? So I think when you ask me, what do I mean by God? I mean what my species means by God, not what one of my members means. I mean holistically what my species means. And I think the best and most accurate representation of what my species does mean, when you get past all the fluff and the gaslighting and the bullshit, is God is a meaningless, incoherent sound that they use to express their unwillingness to do a valid investigation about a natural phenomenon. Now, since I know that I'm frame shifting here and talking about human behavior and thus that ontology, I say my definition doesn't apply to what you're asking me. It truly doesn't. Because you're asking me to give you a definition of what is essentially a comic book character. And instead of saying, well, God is Square Circle Man who shoots a beam that deletes reality, I'm saying I would only be giving you a definition of a comic book character. That's the best that I can get to it. And since I'm an honest interlocutor, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to pretend that I know something about the nature of this being, like it's Square Circle Man and it shoots a beam and that beam deletes reality. These are all claims that should be coming from my observations. When I say he's Square Circle Man, it should be because he looks like the shape of a square in a circle. When I say he shoots a beam, it should be because it's extending some light from his body. But when I say that that beam occurs in reality and it deletes reality, then there should be no beam, right? So these are the incompatible statements. This is why when I'm asking someone, what do they mean by God? I'm not asking for words. And people get confused about that. They're like, well, why are you asking a question if you don't want words? Because words are not what convey the meaning of a thing, the nature of that thing. That words don't do that. We use words to describe the way we're compelled to believe about that. And we're compelled to believe what we think about nature from our observations. So we can't really define the nature of an object. We can approximate it through descriptive definitions. I always pick on the beaver. Beaver's a large rodent of the genus Castor, having sharp incisors, webbed hind feet, and a flattened tail. That's just us referencing notable characteristics that we got from our experience, right? It's from that observation of the beaver. So trying to understand what a beaver is by looking in a dictionary is just doing it the hard way, right? The easiest way to understand what a beaver is isn't to go through words, isn't to convey the meaning of a beaver in a symbolically represented lexicon. It's to just make an observation of the beaver. That's the most meaningful aspect of what the nature of a beaver is. It's going to be conveyed merely by your cognition, your ability to perceive, put that information into some kind of morsel of information for your brain to, logic, and then you understand it, right? And that's the logical pathway. So what does God mean to me? God is a meaningless, incoherent sound that people are using. They think it's a word because they've given it a definition. But like I said, if you're not giving me a definition pertaining to the nature, which is by way of observation, then fuck you, right? You're gaslighting me. You are necessarily, by definition, misrepresenting the facts because you don't have access to them. You're trying to manipulate my brain into believing an obvious falsehood. There is absolutely no positive pathway to acceptance in this conversation. You're a negative person, right? You're not being honest either with yourself or with me. And whether you're not being honest with yourself or with me isn't really my problem. I detect deception, and so I get offended, like that triggered. I treat people like shit when they treat me like shit. When I'm asking someone to convey something about reality and then they gaslight me by appealing entirely to their imagination, it's offensive. And, that's an aspect of our culture. Most human beings respond this way because we're gaslit in our youth to behave like this. That when we offer someone what we think is a meaningful definition about the nature of an object, we just appeal to our imaginations, which is a task that we know ourselves would be offended if you did it to us, right? If I ask you a question and you gaslight me, I'm going to be offended, right? And so I already know that if I gaslight you, you should be offended. And we intentionally do this. We intentionally misrepresent all of this stuff, right? And treat each other like dog shit by persistently, participating in this cultural collective delusion. I think the honest thing to do is just admit to all of ourselves that we're making shit up about reality, and that our conclusions are just that. They're just made up conclusions. Atheists need to admit that because the theists are really bad sources of data, that their conclusion God doesn't exist is not warranted. It's not warranted because there may be some entity out there responsible for a whole bunch of bullshit, and we don't know anything about it, so we just assume that it's not real because these people that do make that logical leap sound stupid when they make the logical leap. But you're still making the logical leap. You're making the same one. You're jumping across that same chasm. They're not jumping by themselves. The atheists are jumping with them, right? Going out on a ledge saying that, hey, based on my, interactions with this group of people that I think are dumb, I'm going to reach a conclusion that isn't warranted. You can't prove a God doesn't exist, so you should lack of belief that they do exist, right? You shouldn't hold on to that idea. But these atheists have YouTube channels. They're promoting it as a philosophy. They're out there trying to convince people. And then when you try to go to their source material, like put the atheists aside for a minute, when you try to go to their source material, holy fucking shit. Theists are so disconnected from reality that you begin to ask, what the fuck are the atheists even talking about when they say they don't believe in the existence? This thing, you don't believe in the existence of this thing or this thing. And you go down the list of gods, right? The atheist is tasked with saying no to every single question. And so going back to how do I define God, and it being however my interlocutor defines it, sometimes my interlocutor defines it as real things. And since my definition of God is useless to the ontological nature of a God, I only have my interlocutor's definition to appeal to. If I pick any other person's definition, let's say I'm talking to person A and they tell me God's square. If I go to anyone else and ask them, I'm making a critical error, right? They're not talking about the same object. They're talking about two different objects. Whatever object 2 and person B's claim, unless they're talking about the same object, that's the only way. If they're both having a shared interrelated experience, but then that's going to be a problem for both sides. Again, the problem's not solved, right? If they're having a shared interrelated experience, what am I objecting to? I'm having the same shared interrelated experience. Allegedly. There it is. They're seeing it, that guy's seeing it, and now a third person, me, I'm seeing it too. So who's objecting to the existence here? None of us. We can all be objecting to what we're observing, right? Our understandings of it or something like that, but we're not objecting to the ontology. That's been hashed out. But if we're not having a shared interrelated experience, that means person A can't observe their thing and person B can't observe their thing. Person C, who's just asking these two parties, I can't observe anything either. So what are we talking about? We're either talking about a thing or we're not talking about a thing. If we're talking about a thing, right, and there's an actual thing there, then we just make our observations and talk about our shared experience. If we're talking about not a thing, the fuck are we talking about? Right? There's just nothing to describe. There's no characteristic that would be indicative of it. There's no way to label a thing that's not there. So I honestly don't know what the atheists are doing. You don't need anti-stamp collectingism. You don't need anti-tennisism. The only reason that atheists feel compelled to define themselves as atheists is because theism is gaslighting them, culturally abusing them, cognitively malnourishing them, not treating them like valid members of the village, right? That's the only reason they're abused by that group. And so you got these two groups like locked in eternal battle because they just keep breeding and then gaslighting their children. It's just like this rinse and repeat. That part's not going away until enough people step back and say, all right, let's get out of hand. Right? You guys don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And you guys, why are you forming a whole philosophy based on you don't accept them? Again, there is valid reasons to reject theistic incursions and shit like that. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying don't fight against theism. I'm saying there is no philosophy of atheism. And so you don't need to call yourself an atheist. And once you abandon atheism and realize there are better philosophies to address the problem that's going on, atheism does not struggle at all with shitting on theism at all. There's literally zero, and I don't have to go out on these ledges and assume a burden that I'm not prepared to have, which is to tell somebody what a god isn't. To make my job as a god of classical theism denier, to make my job easier, I just go around acting like some kind of fucking expert ruling out God. So I don't have a definition. And I think of the ontological nature of God. I have a definition of the ontological nature of human beings and their behavior and their proclivity to talk about imaginary characters, do so poorly of a job of representing those things, that they're horrible, and then people don't want to believe in them, and there's cultural tension, right? There's friction. I have an ontology. I have a burden. I have a philosophy. This is something atheists don't have, and they should get.